While culture is all around us and impacts our behavior on a daily basis, we often don't take the time to really understand how it impacts what we do and how we do it. In this series, we are applying this specifically within our teams, which are becoming more and more diverse. This episode will look at several matrices that have developed in order to explain culture. The goal is to increase our own cultural intelligence so that we will be more effective as a team in fulfilling our purpose and calling.
Welcome to another of Dr. Phil's Leadership Matters podcast. In this series, Phil will be sharing from his decades of serving and leading multicultural teams from Africa to Eastern Europe to Latin America. Just click the link in the description box to download our free resources or the complete study guide. You can also access any of his other podcasts by going to icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters.
In our last episode, we began looking at three key ways we can increase our cultural intelligence. These can be illustrated by three concentric circles. We will now look at continuing to discuss the first of these, our basic cultural knowledge. And then we will turn our attention to the need to develop our own cultural awareness. And in the next episode, we'll then discuss the resultant behavior skills, from this new awareness. It's important to understand that while each culture is diverse, it shares values and behaviors with other cultures, obviously. Hofstede, a Dutch social psychologist who did extensive research on cross-cultural organizations and cultural dimensions, identified 5 cultural dimensions. Each of these groupings does not define a culture completely, but each describes dimensions along a continuum upon which each country can be arranged. He studied over 100,000 employees of large multinational corporations in 50 countries and identified the following groupings of cultures. The individualistic dimension describes cultures where people are more concerned about the consequences of the actions on themselves, not others. Decisions are made by individuals and not the group. He discovered that there was a strong correlation between a country's individualism and its wealth. Now, the collectivistic dimension describes cultures where people view themselves as members of groups and are more concerned with how their actions impact the group. Decisions within these cultures are usually made by consensus or consultation, taking into consideration everyone in the group. Now, the next one, the power distance dimension, seeks to identify how each culture has varying degrees of power differentials between the various status of those in the culture. The higher the power distance, the more likely autocratic behavior by a leader will be tolerated. Now, the uncertainty avoidance dimension describes the degree to which a culture seeks to create stability. In high uncertainty avoidance countries, more formal procedures are implemented with strong norms or procedures to guide actions. They seek to hold all aspects of the society together. And finally, the masculine femininity dimension is the measurement of the balance between the traditional goals of ambition and achievement versus nurturing and interpersonal harmony within the culture. Now, here's some examples, how this applies to 2 different cultures, American versus a Guatemalan culture. In his study, the higher number out of 100, the more extensive these characters are within the culture. And in the table there, you can see the values he assigned from his study. So at 91 value, the U.S. has a very high level of individualism, which should come as no surprise, while Guatemalan culture scores a 6 on the individualism scale. Now at 62, American culture has above average masculinity, which results in high ambition and achievement. Moderate power distance at 40, and moderate uncertainty avoidance at 46. Now, in contrast, Guatemala, though close geographically, has very low individualism at only 6, but a very high power distance at 95, which would indicate as a higher tolerance for autocratic leadership, with below average masculinity of 37 and a very high uncertainty avoidance of 100. In other words, they seek stability, which may explain the low individualism and the higher power distance. Now, using Hofstede's designations, identify your culture and that of each of your team members. How do you think the differences on your team will impact your effectiveness as a team? Another lens through which to view culture is the city-tribal continuum. Tribal, or the old word was peasant societies, are the most homogeneous and have much in common. They are the more traditional and resistant to change. As a culture moves from a more rural society to an urban-based one, the values of the culture also change. There's less cohesion and many more subcultures develop within the majority culture. A scholar who has studied and written extensively regarding culture is David Hasselgrave. You likely maybe read one of his books, though they're not necessarily an easy read. Coming from a Christian worldview, he outlines several cultural patterns that are evident in most societies. Understanding these will help us as we become more aware of the cultural values on our own teams. He organizes these cultural patterns in 5 pairings. It's Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, Dionysianism and Apollonianism, guilt and shame, repression and suppression. Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft identify the fundamental difference in the relationship of the individuals to his group, which impacts his motivations, values, and decisions. Gemeinschaft, which is a German word for community, describes cultures that tend to be more rural and pre-industrial, where communal values dominate the social relationships. These are typically non-Western societies. Gesellschaft, which has the meaning of association, are cultures which are basically more urban, and industrial societies where the individual is free to choose who they relate to and how they relate to. There's more freedom of association. Dionysian cultures are individualistic, where people look beyond the 5 senses in order to experience and explain their existence. This can be dreams, supernatural experiences, and so on. Apollonian cultures limit themselves to describing the world through tradition and distrust the individualism of finding meaning through personal experience. You can see how this would affect the shared values within these groups and make it hard to understand the other's perspectives. On the guilt and shame continuum, guilt cultures are more concerned with each separate violation that goes against known codes in the culture. The emphasis is on decision-making, with the victory over guilt producing right living. In contrast, shame cultures are more concerned with the overall self and the failure to reach the ideal. Emphasis on the ability to live with some indecisiveness and the quality of the experience. Transcending shame leads to a sense of identity and freedom. Repression and suppression is the final pairing his research identifies. In repressive cultures, internal controls are more important in the society. The pattern of life is individually centered, and religion focuses on the search for the meaning of life by the individual and is most often monotheistic. Suppression cultures, on the other hand, emphasize external controls, and the pattern of life is situation-centered. Religions stress the need to be aligned with every power, which leads to polytheism or many gods. Some of the implications for discipling others, leadership development and leading multicultural teams may be rather obvious. There are also some nuances that may be not quite so obvious. Depending on how close the country's culture is to biblical values, will likely determine the resistance to changing hearts and minds to a biblical worldview from the prevalent cultural one. These differences must also be taken into consideration by the team that's called to serve within that community. Understanding Hasselgrave's matrix, identify the key indicators of the majority culture within which your team operates. How has your cultural biases affected your perceptions of others and the values that you attribute to their behaviors?
You can view or listen to any of Phil's other podcast series by going to icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters. These include Mentoring Intelligence, Finishing Our Race, the Fivefold Ministry, as well as a variety of other leadership series he has taught over the years. You could also check out our Christian Leadership Institute, which is a unique competency-based ministerial mentorship. To download any of our resources associated with these series, visit our library of materials at icm.org/resources.
We've been discussing some of the aspects of culture in order to increase our own knowledge so that we can increase our own cultural quotient. The next step is to increase our awareness so that we can better interpret cultural cues or indicators in ourselves and others. Learning to pay attention to cultural cues and interpreting them is a skill we can all learn. How do we interpret actions of others that seem to be based on values that are actually very different than our own? Every culture has its own narrative or script. We have that personally, but also cultures have that. And these are explanations as to what is acceptable behavior in a culture and they're often shorthand or code for understanding values. Those of us with Christian worldview believe that each culture is fallen due to sin. Yet believers in every country have to evaluate what aspects of their culture contradict biblical values and which don't. Often we begin to interact with those from these different cultures, we begin to realize that believers from various cultures have come to different conclusions about what is actual sin, and often this is based on their cultural values. Of course, there is general agreement on the major themes like, items like don't lie, don't steal, don't kill. But what about the gray areas? For example, while all believers would likely agree that drinking alcohol in excess violates basic biblical commands, Christians in some cultures do not feel a prohibition on all alcohol consumption is warranted from the scriptures, while others take more of a zero-tolerance approach. So in those areas that may not be categorically immoral for some, problems arise when we have to interact with others who have grown up with quite a different narrative. We'll be confronted with the decision. Either these team members are sinners or my deeply held beliefs are more cultural than they are biblical. I grew up in a more zero-tolerance culture, since most people that drank in our culture tend to do so either to get drunk or to medicate to numb their pain. Now, this cultural bias served me well in Africa, where the evangelical church also held this view. No Christian or church leader would ever allow the fermented fruit of the vine to touch their lips. Of course, then I moved to Berlin. At my first spiritual weekend retreat with local German pastors, I discovered that a good day of prayer was usually capped off with a good beer over dinner. After all, we were only an hour and a half away from Luther's old stomping grounds, and he did have the largest brewery in Wittenberg in the day. Now, either all of these pastors were on a direct path to hell and perdition, or my deeply held beliefs were more cultural than biblical, or at the very least contextual. Beer in this context was merely a beverage, and no one really drank to excess. This means we have to understand and interpret their actions rather than just relying on our own scripts. This is important in multicultural teams in dealing with different ways of doing things, and becomes particularly complex in differentiating between cultural differences based on moral judgments. However, if we do not engage in this process, we will get locked in the box of our own thinking and not able to adapt to see the value of others. This requires all members of the team not only understand their cultural biases, but also understand where the other person is coming from. Their context. Paul brings this up in his discussion of meat offered to idols. We don't have the freedom to offend others in areas where their culture has bound them. Maybe discuss some of the difference between your team members and their conclusions as to what is cultural versus what is biblical. So to function with any society or culture requires developing a certain cultural muscle memory. This means that without patterns of behavior, we do not need to consciously think about. We would have to expend lots of energy on just some basic repetitive tasks, but muscle memory works well because we don't have to think about that consciously. But it works well in our own culture. But once we interact with other cultures, it can be an impediment to relationships. This happens as we make the assumptions that others share our cultural scripts and norms, when maybe they don't. But as we learn to take notice of others' reactions to our behaviors, we can take steps to change. Paying attention to context means that we have to engage in mental programming. We looked at this in our previous episode. It does not mean abandoning our own identity or values, but rather to be aware of the differences and think differently in those areas that are neither moral or immoral, but they're just different, they're amoral. Are there areas that you have cultural muscle memory that's caused friction in your interaction with others on your team? Have each team member share their personal values in contrast to their national cultural values. In what ways is there conflict? and which ways is there harmony, and discuss how this impacts the team. Okay, what are some practical steps? First, I think we need to be aware of our own assumptions, our ideas, and emotions that have been embedded in our cultural script, and notice the other person and their assumptions, words, and behavior. This requires using all of our senses, not just listening to their words and then viewing the situation from a variety of perspectives. Understanding their context can help us to not wrongly interpret their behavior, not stereotyping people and putting them in boxes of our own making. Finally, this requires continually seeking out new information in order to confirm or discard our ideas of others and putting ourselves in the place of others. In our next session, we'll take a deeper look into specific behaviors we can modify to make our teams function more cohesively.
Thank you for listening to Leadership Matters and subscribing and sharing us. If you would like to have your own copy of this study, just click on the link in the description box. For any of our other leadership resources, check out our website, www.icmcanada.org/resources.